Will New York City Mayor Eric Adams tell New Yorkers to make Molotov cocktails? Since the beginning of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, the American government, NATO, and others have been telling the Ukrainian citizens to fight back and to also make Molotov cocktails. The world is claiming that Vladimir Putin is a war criminal who is killing Ukrainian civilians. But look at what's going on inside of New York City. Look at the high crime rate that's inside of New York City. There are war criminals inside of New York City, but the American government doesn't want to call or label them war criminals. This isn't just happening inside of New York City. This is happening inside of large numbers of cities within the United States of America. There are civilians who are being killed inside of New York City and the rest of America. In New York City, you have a large number of stabbings and shootings within the city. People are being knifed up and shot down inside of New York City. Civilians within New York City are being killed by war criminals, and nobody calls these acts war crimes. And the fake police officers that they have inside of New York City are not helping, and a police officer will kill a black man before he ever saves a black man. And the fake politicians who are being voted in every 4 years are not helping. It's the beginning of 2022, and Eric Adams has a higher crime rate than de Blasio did in 2021. And Adam is claiming to be the crime prevention mayor, and that's why he was elected, because he fooled the New York City citizens by telling them that he's the Batman of Gotham City. Eric Adams loves crime. He made money as a police officer. If crimes didn't exist, then the profession of a police officer wouldn't exist. And now he's making more money off of crime inside of New York City. He fooled voters and made them think that he was the solution to the mathematical crime problem of New York City. The answer isn't the police or the mayor. The answer is the civilians in New York City. Crime stops in New York City when the citizens begin to say it's vigilante time. Crime ends in New York City when civilians start doing what they are telling the Ukrainian people to do, which is to fight back and make Molotov cocktails. Crime ends when there is a black Charles Bronson, a Hispanic Charles Bronson, an Asian Charles Bronson, and a white Charles Bronson. That's when crime ends in New York City. When New York City citizens start to fight back, then there will be a reduction of crime in New York City. And when that happens, the majority of police officers in New York City will lose their job. And New York City doesn't want their white Christian brothers to lose their jobs in New York City. Therefore, that's why you see these large number of gun crimes and other crimes happening inside of black communities in New York City. These are government operations that reduce the black population, which allows the government to control the black population. These are the government mandated murders of black men and black civilians within America. The New York City government, the New York state government, and the federal government have the capabilities to stop these crimes in New York City, but the government doesn't want to. They want crimes to continue. This is the gun slave trade. What will happen if crime ends in New York City? You would then put hundreds of thousands of white people out of a job. It's not just the police officers. There is the district attorney's office in the different counties with thousands of employees. There are thousands of doctors, nurses, and other medical staff that take care of bullet wounds in hospitals and shout, "We've got a gunshot wound, stat, ICU." You have the private defendant attorneys, the public defenders, the correctional officers, and funeral agencies, the judges, and courtroom staff, and additional industries that profit off of blacks and others being victims of crime in New York City. And what do they tell black people to do? They don't tell black people to fight back. They have been telling black people to hold hands with their white slave masters and forgive their white slave masters for the war crimes that they have committed upon them for centuries. And black people are still victims of war crimes in America today. Eric Adams is a puppet for the white man, and Eric Adams will allow these crimes to continue because it's the white population who voted him into office. Black people don't have the population to vote anybody into office. New York City has a population of over 8 million people, and 42% and a 42% population, white population, and a 24% black population. Therefore, there's an average of 3.4 million white people in New York City and an average of 1.9 million black people in New York City. And the government wants that population to remain that way. And that's how you control black people, by making sure that they have a minority population. They are not minorities because they're black. They are minorities because they have a minority population. When Andrew Cuomo said that the gun violence in New York City was a civil rights issue and that the majority of people who were being shot in New York City were black, and he further said that he was going to do something about it, they mysteriously got rid of Cuomo and said that he was a sexual predator. This can be compared to the assassination of JFK. On June 11, 1963, JFK was looking to sign a civil rights bill into law, which is now known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But he was mysteriously assassinated on November 22, 1963, which was 5 months later. Cuomo was getting ready to mess with certain white interests. Cuomo's replacement was Kathy Hochul, and she is being backed by the NRA, the National Rifle Association. Eric Adams has security as the mayor of New York City, and he also has a right to carry a gun. Maya Wiley was running for New York City mayor, and she was fooling people with defund the police, and she was paying for private security in her own neighborhood. And there are Jewish neighborhoods that have private security, which is called Shamrim. If the NYPD exists in New York City, then why do all of these people have private or personal security? And black people don't have private or personal security when they are the ones who are mostly the victims of gun crimes in New York City. They are the ones who are being knifed up and shot down inside of New York City. This is happening to black people because they do not have personal or private security for black people. And black people are not protecting themselves. Guns are not only for drug boys, gangsters, and criminals. Guns are also for the good guys and the good black people. But New York City is running their police scam and claiming that the NYPD will protect you when it is not a police officer's job to protect the citizens of New York City. They are just supposed to uphold the law, which is to clean up the body off of the streets if you are a victim and search for the suspect of the crime. Ukraine has an army, but they are telling Ukrainian civilians to pick up guns and other weapons to protect themselves. And there are more people who are being stabbed, shot, assaulted, raped, robbed, and killed in New York City than wars within a year. When I first walked into a boxing gym in Brooklyn, New York, I was around 15 years old. And my trainer wasn't a drug boy or a gangster, but he had his gun at home, and it was an unlicensed gun in New York City. And he told me, boxing isn't New York City. In boxing, you have to protect yourself at all times. You hear about these stories about children getting beat up by bullies and gangs in school, and people are being attacked on the streets of New York. That ain't boxing. If somebody gets a gun, then you get a gun. If somebody gets a gang, then you get a gang. That's what boxing is about. If somebody hits you with a left hook, then you hit him with a right hand. If somebody hits harder than you, then you use your speed and you hit him 10 times within 2 seconds. New York City trains their citizens to lay down and die. In boxing, you have to protect yourself at all times.